The gentle rocking of the ship usually lulled me to sleep, but not tonight. I lay wide awake in my bunk, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. Something was wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that our lives were about to change forever. I'm Tom, and I've been working on cruise ships for the better part of a decade. I've seen my fair share of strange occurrences at sea, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened on the Coral Princess that fateful night. It was supposed to be a routine Caribbean cruise, sun, sand, and happy vacationers. But as I tossed and turned in my crew quarters, I couldn't ignore the growing sense of dread in the pit of my stomach. A loud knock jolted me from my thoughts. "Tom, we need you on deck now!" It was Jake, one of the junior crew members. His voice was shaky, tinged with panic. I threw on my uniform and rushed topside. The night air was thick with humidity, and an eerie fog had settled over the ship. As I approached the starboard side, I saw a small crowd gathered near one of the lifeboats. "What's going on?" I asked, pushing my way through. Captain Miller turned to me, his face ashen. "We've got a situation, Tom. Lifeboat 4 has... well, see for yourself." I peered over the railing and my blood ran cold. Lifeboat 4 was swinging wildly on its davits, the ropes creaking ominously. But that wasn't what made my heart race. No, it was the faint, ghostly glow emanating from within the boat, pulsing like a heartbeat. "It started about an hour ago," Jake whispered beside me. "We heard strange noises, and when we came to check..." I squinted, trying to make out what was inside. For a split second, I thought I saw a face, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare right through me. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. "We need to lower it," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "Whatever's in there, we can't risk it staying on the ship." The captain nodded grimly. "Agreed. Tom, you're the most experienced. I need you to go down there and check it out." My stomach churned, but I knew I had no choice. As I strapped on a safety harness, Jake grabbed my arm. "Be careful, man. There's something not right about that boat." I gave him a weak smile and began my descent. The closer I got to Lifeboat 4, the colder the air became. My breath fogged in front of me despite the warm Caribbean night. As my feet touched the deck of the lifeboat, the glow intensified. The entire boat hummed with an otherworldly energy. I fumbled for my flashlight with trembling hands. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing rows of empty seats, but there in the far corner was a small, leather-bound book. It looked ancient, its cover worn and cracked. I reached for it, my fingers brushing against the cold leather. Suddenly, a jolt of electricity shot up my arm. Images flashed before my eyes, a storm-tossed sea, screaming passengers, and this very lifeboat adrift in the vast ocean. I gasped, dropping the book. It fell open and I caught a glimpse of faded writing. "The souls of the lost shall find no rest," I read aloud, my voice barely a whisper. A gust of wind whipped around me and I heard what sounded like distant wailing. The lifeboat began to rock violently. "Tom, what's happening down there?" The captain's voice crackled over my radio, but it sounded far away, distorted. I tried to respond, but my voice caught in my throat. The air around me shimmered and ghostly figures began to materialize. Men, women, and children, their faces etched with terror and despair. One of them, a young woman in a tattered dress, reached out to me. Her hand passed through my arm, leaving an icy trail in its wake. "Help us," she pleaded, her voice echoing as if from the bottom of the sea. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the side of the boat. Who are you?" I managed to choke out. The spirits swirled around me, their voices blending into a haunting chorus. "We are the forgotten," they said in unison. "Lost at sea, our stories untold. This lifeboat was our last hope, now our eternal prison." My mind raced. I'd heard stories, of course, tales of ghost ships and cursed vessels, but I'd always dismissed them as sailors' superstitions. Now, faced with the undeniable truth, I felt my worldview shifting beneath my feet. "What do you want?" I asked, trying to keep my voice from shaking. The young woman drifted closer. "Release," she whispered. "We've been bound to this lifeboat for decades, unable to move on. The captain, he left us to die." I frowned, confused. "But this lifeboat is new. It's only been on the Coral Princess for a few years." A sad smile played on the woman's translucent lips. "The boat may be new, but the curse is old. It follows, latching onto new vessels, trapping more souls with each passing year. My radio crackled again. "Tom, do you copy? We're pulling you up." I felt the lifeboat lurch as the crew began to raise it. The spirits grew agitated, swirling faster around me. "No!" the young woman cried. "If we return to the ship, more souls will be in danger. You must set us free." "How?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "How do I free you?" The leather-bound book at my feet began to glow. "The words," an old man's spirit said, pointing a gnarled finger. "Speak the words to break the curse." With shaking hands, I picked up the book. The lifeboat was halfway back to the deck now. I could hear the concerned shouts of my crewmates. I opened the book to a page that seemed to glow brighter than the rest. The words were in a language I didn't recognize, but somehow I knew how to pronounce them. As I began to read, the wind picked up, howling around the lifeboat. The spirit swirled faster and faster, becoming a blur of ethereal light. "Keep reading," the young woman urged. "We can feel the bonds breaking." I raised my voice, shouting the words over the wind. The book grew hot in my hands, but I didn't dare let go. Just as the lifeboat reached the deck, I spoke the final word. There was a blinding flash of light, and I was thrown backward. When my vision cleared, I found myself sprawled on the deck of the Coral Princess. The lifeboat hung empty and still beside me. The book was gone. Captain Miller and Jake rushed to my side. "Tom, are you all right? What happened down there?" I looked up at them, then back at the lifeboat. It looked ordinary now. No glow, no spirits, no sense of otherworldly dread. I'm not sure you'd believe me if I told you," I said softly. Over the next few days, as we continued our cruise, I kept a close eye on Lifeboat 4. But there were no more strange occurrences. The oppressive atmosphere that had hung over the ship lifted, and passengers commented on how much brighter and more cheerful everything seemed. I never told anyone the full story of what happened that night. Who would believe me? But sometimes when I'm on night watch and the sea is calm, I think I catch a glimpse of familiar faces in the moonlight on the waves, smiling, peaceful, and finally free. As for me, I stayed on with the cruise line. But I've developed a new respect for the sea and its mysteries, and every time I pass a lifeboat, I say a silent prayer for those lost souls who might still be searching for their release. The ocean holds many secrets, and that night I learned that some are better left undisturbed. But I also learned that even in the darkest moments, there's always hope for redemption and peace. Now, years later, as I prepare for my final voyage before retirement, I can't help but think back to that night. It changed me, opened my eyes to a world beyond our own. And while part of me hopes to never encounter anything like it again, another part of me wonders what other mysteries are out there waiting to be uncovered in the vast, beautiful, and sometimes terrifying expanse of the sea. The moment I stepped into that sauna, I knew something was terribly wrong. The air was thick with more than just steam. It was heavy with a presence I couldn't explain. If only I'd trusted my instincts and turned back. But I didn't. And now I'm not sure I'll ever feel clean again. My name's Sarah, and I've worked as a spa attendant on luxury cruise ships for the past 5 years. I've seen it all: entitled passengers, wild parties, even the occasional minor disaster. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened in the sauna of the SS Oceanic Dream. It was the third night of a 2-week Mediterranean cruise. The ship was state-of-the-art, with all the amenities you could imagine. The spa area was my domain, a sprawling complex of treatment rooms, pools, and relaxation areas. And tucked away in a corner, accessible only through a winding corridor of marble and mood lighting, was the sauna. I was doing my final rounds before closing up for the night. Most passengers were at dinner or enjoying the evening's entertainment. The spa was quiet, just the soft hum of filtration systems and the occasional splash from the pool. As I approached the sauna, I noticed the in-use light was on. Strange, I thought. I was sure everyone had left hours ago. I knocked gently on the door. "Hello? The spa's closing soon. Just wanted to give you a heads up." No response. I frowned, pressing my ear to the door. Was that whispering? I couldn't make out the words, but there was definitely someone or something inside. "Excuse me?" I called again, louder this time. "I'm coming in, okay?" I pushed open the heavy wooden door and a wave of heat hit me. The sauna was dimly lit as usual, but something felt off. The air was oppressive, almost suffocating, and then I saw them. In the far corner, barely visible through the steam, were three figures. They sat perfectly still, their features obscured by the haze. I squinted, trying to make out details. "I'm sorry, but we're closing up," I said, my voice wavering slightly. "You'll need to." My words died in my throat as one of the figures turned towards me. In the dim light, I could have sworn its eyes glowed red. I blinked hard, sure I was seeing things. When I looked again, the figures were gone. My heart pounding, I quickly scanned the room. Empty. No sign anyone had been there at all. The benches were dry, no towels in sight. I backed out of the sauna, my skin crawling. What had I just seen? I must be more tired than I thought, I reasoned. Long hours and the constant motion of the ship were playing tricks on my mind. I locked up the spa area and headed to my cabin, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. But as I drifted off to sleep, those glowing red eyes haunted my dreams. The next morning, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. The bright Mediterranean sun streaming through my porthole made the events of the previous night seem ridiculous. I went about my day as usual, giving massages, running the hot tub, and answering passenger questions. But as evening approached, I felt a growing sense of dread. "Hey, Sarah?" It was my colleague, Mike. "Can you do the final sauna check tonight? I've got a family emergency call I need to make." My stomach dropped, but I nodded. "Sure, no problem." As I made my way through the spa that night, every shadow seemed to move. Every creak of the ship made me jump. I stood outside the sauna door, my hand on the handle. The in-use light was on again. Taking a deep breath, I knocked. "Hello, we're closing up." Silence. With trembling hands, I pushed open the door. The heat enveloped me, along with that same oppressive feeling from the night before. Through the steam, I saw them again. Three figures motionless in the corner. But this time, they weren't alone. A fourth figure sat on the opposite bench. I recognized her with a jolt. Mrs. Rossi, an elderly passenger I'd chatted with earlier that day. "Mrs. Rossi," I called out, my voice shaking. "Are you all right?" She turned to me slowly, her eyes wide with fear. "Help me," she whispered. I rushed towards her, but before I could reach her, the other figures moved. In a blur of motion I couldn't quite process, they were suddenly surrounding Mrs. Rossi. I heard a scream, whether it was hers or mine, I'm not sure. The steam thickened, obscuring my view. I stumbled forward, reaching out blindly. My hand touched something cold and slimy. I recoiled, falling backwards onto the hot tiles. When my vision cleared, the sauna was empty. No Mrs. Rossi, no mysterious figures. Just me sprawled on the floor, my heart threatening to burst from my chest. I scrambled to my feet and ran, not stopping until I reached the security office. Between gasps, I told the night security officer what I'd seen. He looked at me skeptically, but agreed to check it out. We reviewed the security footage together. The camera outside the sauna showed Mrs. Rossi entering alone at 9:47 p.m. No one else went in or out until I arrived for the final check. The footage showed me entering the sauna, then running out moments later. There was no sign of the figures I'd seen, no evidence of any disturbance. "Look," the security officer said gently, "I know the late shifts can be tough. Maybe you should take tomorrow off, get some rest." I wanted to argue, to make him understand what I'd seen was real, but I knew how it sounded. I nodded mutely and left. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those glowing red orbs, heard Mrs. Rossi's terrified whisper. The next morning, I went straight to Mrs. Rossi's cabin. No answer. I checked with guest services. She hadn't been seen since the previous evening. As the day wore on, a ship-wide search was initiated. They checked every cabin, every public area, but Mrs. Rossi had vanished without a trace. I was questioned, of course, but with no evidence and a security tape that showed nothing unusual, my story was dismissed as stress-induced hallucination. The official story was that Mrs. Rossi must have fallen overboard. A tragic accident, they said. These things happen sometimes, especially with elderly passengers. But I knew the truth. Whatever had happened in that sauna, it wasn't natural, and I was terrified it would happen again. For the rest of the cruise, I avoided the spa area as much as possible, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Sometimes, out of the corner of my eye, I'd catch a glimpse of a shadowy figure. But when I turned to look, it was gone. The whispers started a few days later. At first, I thought it was just passengers talking as I passed. But soon I realized the voices were too faint, the words just out of reach of comprehension. They followed me everywhere, in my cabin, on deck, even in the crowded dining room, always just on the edge of hearing, growing louder when I was alone. I stopped sleeping, afraid of what might be waiting in my dreams. My colleagues noticed, suggesting I visit the ship's doctor. But how could I explain what was happening without sounding completely insane? As we neared the end of the cruise, my fear turned to desperation. I had to know what was in that sauna, had to understand what had happened to Mrs. Rossi. On our final night at sea, I snuck into the spa after hours. The in-use light on the sauna was on, as I knew it would be. My whole body shook as I approached the door. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening. I could almost make out words now, ancient guttural sounds that made my skin crawl. I placed my hand on the door handle. This was it. Whatever was on the other side, I had to face it. I had to know the truth. I took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The heat hit me like a wall, far more intense than any sauna should be. Steam filled my vision, and for a moment I saw nothing. Then as the mist parted, I saw them. Not just 3 figures this time, but dozens. Shadowy forms with glowing red eyes surrounding a central figure I recognized with horror. It was me. Or rather, something wearing my face. It smiled, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth. "We've been waiting for you, Sarah," it said in my voice. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The shadows closed in, their whispers growing to a roar. I felt cold hands grabbing at me, pulling me deeper into the steam. The last thing I saw was my own face, grinning malevolently as the door swung shut. I don't know how long I was in there. Time seemed to lose all meaning. I remember flashes, impossible geometries, alien landscapes, and always those glowing red eyes. When I came to, I was lying on the deck outside the spa. A concerned passenger had found me and called for help. They told me I had been missing for 3 days. 3 days I couldn't account for, 3 days lost to whatever madness lurked in that sauna. I left the ship as soon as we docked. I've never set foot on a cruise ship again. I've tried to move on, to forget what happened. But some nights I still hear those whispers. And sometimes, when I catch my reflection in a mirror, I could swear my eyes flash red for just a moment. Whatever was in that sauna, I fear it's not done with me yet. And I can't help but wonder, how many other ships are out there carrying hidden horrors behind their gleaming facades? How many other passengers and crew have fallen victim to terrors beyond human understanding? All I know is this. If you're ever on a cruise and feel a chill as you pass the spa, if you hear whispers from behind a closed sauna door, run, and don't look back. Because some mysteries are better left unsolved, some doors better left unopened. And whatever you do, never, ever enter the sauna alone. The moment Captain Miller's eyes rolled back in his head, I knew our pleasant Caribbean cruise had just become a voyage into hell. His body went rigid, his voice deepened to an inhuman growl, and suddenly we were all trapped on a floating nightmare with a madman at the helm. My name's Jack, and I've been first officer on the Paradise Dream for 3 years now. I've weathered storms, dealt with unruly passengers, and even helped deliver a baby mid-cruise once. But nothing in my training prepared me for the day our captain became possessed by something. It started like any other day at sea. Clear skies, calm waters, and 2,000 passengers blissfully unaware of the horror that was about to unfold. I was on the bridge checking our course when Captain Miller walked in. "Morning, Jack," he said, his voice oddly strained. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" I turned to greet him and froze. His face was pale, almost gray, and a thin sheen of sweat covered his forehead. "You all right, sir?" I asked, concern creeping into my voice. He waved off my question. "Never better, just didn't sleep well." I should have pushed harder, should have seen the signs. But hindsight's always 20/20ths, isn't it? As the day wore on, the captain's behavior became increasingly erratic. He snapped at crew members, muttered to himself, and kept staring out to sea with an intensity that made my skin crawl. It was during the evening announcements that everything went to hell. Captain Miller stood at the microphone, his usual cheerful demeanor nowhere to be seen. "Attention, passengers," he began, his voice low and gravelly. "There's been a change of plans." I exchanged worried glances with the other bridge officers. This wasn't part of our itinerary. "We're setting a new course," the captain continued. "One that will take us to deeper waters." Suddenly, he clutched his head and let out an agonized scream. I rushed to his side, but before I could reach him, he straightened up. When he turned to face me, his eyes were completely black. "The captain isn't here right now," he growled, a twisted smile spreading across his face. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. Things like this didn't happen in real life, only in movies or nightmares. But the nightmare was just beginning. With inhuman strength, the captain, or whatever was controlling him, shoved me aside and lunged for the ship's controls. "Sir, stop!" I yelled, trying to pull him away. But it was like trying to move a statue. He didn't even flinch as he wrenched the ship's wheel, setting us on a new course. Alarms blared as we veered sharply off our planned route. I could hear panicked shouts from the passengers on the decks below. "What are you doing?" I demanded, my voice shaking despite my efforts to stay calm. The thing wearing Captain Miller's face turned to me, that unnatural smile still in place. "Taking us home," it said simply. Over the next few hours, chaos reigned on the Paradise Dream. Passengers panicked, crew members tried desperately to maintain order, and all the while our possessed captain steered us further and further from our planned route. I tried everything I could think of to stop him. I attempted to reason with whatever entity had taken control. I tried to physically restrain him. I even considered trying to sedate him. But nothing worked. It was like he was made of stone, immovable and unstoppable. As night fell, an unnatural fog rolled in, thick and oppressive. Visibility dropped to near zero. The temperature plummeted, leaving passengers and crew shivering despite the usually warm Caribbean climate. I stood on the bridge, watching helplessly as Captain Miller navigated through the fog with an eerie precision. How could he see where we were going? And more importantly, where exactly was that? "Sir," I said, trying one more time to reach him, "please think of the passengers. Their safety is our responsibility." For a moment, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes, but it was quickly replaced by that terrible, empty blackness. "Their safety," he laughed, the sound sending chills down my spine. "Oh, Jack, where we're going, safety is the least of their concerns." As the night wore on, strange things began happening all over the ship. Passengers reported seeing ghostly figures in the corridors, objects moved on their own in the dining room, and from somewhere deep within the ship came a low, constant moan, like the creaking of metal under immense pressure. I tried to keep everyone calm, but how could I when I was terrified myself? We were sailing into unknown waters, guided by a man who was no longer himself, heading towards God knows what. Around midnight, the fog suddenly cleared, but what I saw made me wish for its return. We were surrounded by ships, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, stretching as far as the eye could see in every direction. But these weren't modern vessels, no, these were ships from every era, Spanish galleons, Viking longboats, 19th century steamers, and all of them looked wrong, rotted, broken, impossibly ancient. A floating graveyard of vessels that should have been long lost to the sea, and we were sailing right into the heart of it. "My God," I whispered, unable to believe my eyes. Captain Miller laughed again, that horrible, inhuman sound. "God has no power here, Jack. This is the domain of older, darker things." As we moved deeper into the fleet of ghost ships, I could see movement on their decks. Shadowy figures, barely more than mist, moved about. Were they the crews of these ancient vessels? Souls trapped for centuries, unable to find rest? The moaning sound from within our ship grew louder, and I realized with horror that the Paradise Dream was changing. Rust spread across its once gleaming surfaces. Wood rotted before my eyes. It was as if the ship was aging decades in minutes. And still, we sailed on. Passengers were screaming now, huddled on the decks, watching in terror as we passed through this impossible armada. Crew members tried to maintain order, but how do you stay calm in the face of the impossible? I made one last, desperate attempt to wrest control from Captain Miller, but as I approached him, he turned to me with those pitch-black eyes. "It's too late, Jack," he said almost gently. "We're home." Ahead of us, the ghost ships parted, revealing a swirling vortex in the water. It was massive, a whirlpool large enough to swallow our entire ship. And at its center, deep below the surface, I could see a pulsing, sickly green light. "What is that?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The heart of the sea," Captain Miller replied. "The place where all lost ships go, where we belong now." As we approached the edge of the vortex, I closed my eyes. This was it. We were going to be pulled down, joining the ranks of these ghost ships for eternity. But then something unexpected happened. A voice cut through the howling wind and the screams of the passengers, a voice I recognized. "Tom Miller, you snap out of this right now." I opened my eyes to see Mrs. Miller, the captain's wife, standing on the bridge. She must have fought her way through the chaos to get here. She marched right up to her possessed husband, seeming not to notice or care about his blackened eyes or the oppressive supernatural atmosphere. "I don't know what kind of nonsense you think you're pulling," she said, jabbing a finger into his chest. "But I did not spend 40 years putting up with your stubborn behind to end up in some Davy Jones locker situation. You turn this ship around right now, or so help me, you'll be sleeping on the couch for the next millennium." To my utter amazement, Captain Miller blinked. His eyes cleared, returning to their normal blue. He looked around in confusion. "Margaret?" he said, his voice back to normal. What's happening?" The vortex behind us began to close. The ghost ships faded like mist in the morning sun. Slowly, the Paradise Dream began to revert to its former state, rust disappearing, wood returning to pristine condition. As the sun rose, we found ourselves back on our original course, as if nothing had happened. But the haunted looks in the eyes of passengers and crew told a different story. We never spoke publicly about what happened that night. Who would believe us? We attributed the course change to a navigation error, the panic to a misunderstanding. But I knew the truth. We had sailed to the edge of something ancient and terrifying, nearly becoming part of a fleet of ghost ships doomed to sail for eternity. And we had been saved by the power of a love strong enough to break through even supernatural possession. Captain Miller retired after that cruise. Can't say I blame him. I'm still sailing, but I'll never look at the sea the same way again. Because now I know what's out there, waiting in the deep. And I know that sometimes the scariest things aren't the supernatural horrors, but the power they have to turn the people we trust against us. So if you're ever on a cruise and you notice the captain acting strangely, keep an eye out. And maybe, just maybe, have his wife on speed dial. You never know when you might need a love strong enough to save you from the very heart of the sea. The ocean was as still as glass the night I heard the footsteps. There wasn't a soul in sight, but the sound of shoes on wood was as clear as a bell. That's when I knew. Some passengers never disembark. I'm Sarah, and I've been working as a security officer on the Majestic Seas for 5 years now. It's a job that's mostly about dealing with drunk tourists and the occasional petty theft. But that night changed everything I thought I knew about this ship, about reality itself. It was the last night of a Caribbean cruise, somewhere between Jamaica and Miami. Most of the passengers had turned in early, nursing sunburns and hangovers, preparing for disembarkation the next morning. I was doing my usual rounds on the upper decks, enjoying the rare moment of quiet. The night was unusually still, no wind, no waves. The ship's wake was the only thing disturbing the mirror-like surface of the ocean. Stars reflected perfectly in the water, making it seem like we were floating through space. It was beautiful, but eerie, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I just finished checking the Lido deck and was heading towards the stern when I heard it. Footsteps, coming from the deck above me. Slow, measured steps. Thump, thump, thump. The sound echoed in the quiet night, impossibly loud. At first, I thought nothing of it. Probably just a restless passenger out for a late-night stroll. But then I remembered. The deck above was closed for maintenance, had been all week. There shouldn't have been anyone up there. I reached for my radio, intending to call it in when the footsteps suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, frozen, straining my ears. For a moment there was nothing. Then the footsteps started again. But this time they were coming from directly overhead, moving faster now, as if whoever or whatever was up there had noticed me. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and scared, even to my own ears. "This is ship security. The upper deck is off limits. Please identify yourself." No response. Just those relentless footsteps moving back and forth now, pacing. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. This was my job, after all. If someone had gotten into a restricted area, I needed to check it out. I made my way to the nearest stairwell, my hand resting on the taser at my hip, just in case. The stairwell was dark, lit only by the faint glow of emergency lighting. As I climbed, the sound of the footsteps grew louder. They seemed to be coming from everywhere now, echoing off the metal walls. It was disorienting, making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. I reached the door to the upper deck, my hand shaking slightly as I pushed it open. The cool night air hit me like a slap to the face. I blinked, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The deck was empty. I stepped out, my shoes squeaking slightly on the freshly painted surface. "Hello?" I called out again. "Is anyone there?" The footsteps had stopped. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of the ship's engines. I did a slow turn, scanning the deck. Nothing seemed out of place. No signs that anyone had been here. I was about to turn back to radio in that it had been a false alarm when I saw it. A wet footprint, glistening in the moonlight, just one. In the middle of the deck, as if someone had stepped out of thin air, taken a single step, and then vanished again. I approached it cautiously, my heart racing. It was definitely a footprint. I could make out the treads of a shoe, but there was something off about it. It seemed too big, somehow distorted. And the liquid, it wasn't water. It was too dark, too thick. As I knelt down to get a closer look, I heard it again. Footsteps, but this time they were behind me. I spun around, my hand flying to my taser. There was no one there, but the footsteps continued, getting closer. Thump, thump, thump. I backed away, my eyes darting around wildly. "This isn't funny," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Whoever you are, show yourself now." The footsteps stopped, right in front of me. I could feel something, a presence. The air seemed to grow colder, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. That's when I smelled it. Salt. Rot. The unmistakable stench of the sea, but wrong somehow. Like something that had been under the waves for far too long. I turned to run, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like they were glued to the deck. I looked down and saw, to my horror, that I was standing in a puddle of that same dark liquid. It was creeping up my shoes, my ankles, holding me in place. The ocean was as still as glass the night I heard the footsteps. There wasn't a soul in sight, but the sound of shoes on wood was as clear as a bell. That's when I knew. Some passengers never disembark. I'm Sarah, and I've been working as a security officer on the Majestic Seas for 5 years now. It's a job that's mostly about dealing with drunk tourists and the occasional petty theft. But that night changed everything I thought I knew about this ship, about reality itself. It was the last night of a Caribbean cruise, somewhere between Jamaica and Miami. Most of the passengers had turned in early, nursing sunburns and hangovers, preparing for disembarkation the next morning. I was doing my usual rounds on the upper decks, enjoying the rare moment of quiet. The night was unusually still, no wind, no waves. The ship's wake was the only thing disturbing the mirror-like surface of the ocean. Stars reflected perfectly in the water, making it seem like we were floating through space. It was beautiful, but eerie, like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I just finished checking the Lido deck and was heading towards the stern when I heard it. Footsteps, coming from the deck above me. Slow, measured steps. Thump, thump, thump. The sound echoed in the quiet night, impossibly loud. At first, I thought nothing of it. Probably just a restless passenger out for a late-night stroll. But then I remembered. The deck above was closed for maintenance, had been all week. There shouldn't have been anyone up there. I reached for my radio, intending to call it in when the footsteps suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, frozen, straining my ears. For a moment there was nothing. Then the footsteps started again. But this time they were coming from directly overhead, moving faster now, as if whoever or whatever was up there had noticed me. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding thin and scared, even to my own ears. "This is ship security. The upper deck is off limits. Please identify yourself." No response. Just those relentless footsteps moving back and forth now, pacing. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. This was my job, after all. If someone had gotten into a restricted area, I needed to check it out. I made my way to the nearest stairwell, my hand resting on the taser at my hip, just in case. The stairwell was dark, lit only by the faint glow of emergency lighting. As I climbed, the sound of the footsteps grew louder. They seemed to be coming from everywhere now, echoing off the metal walls. It was disorienting, making it impossible to tell where they were coming from. I reached the door to the upper deck, my hand shaking slightly as I pushed it open. The cool night air hit me like a slap to the face. I blinked, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The deck was empty. I stepped out, my shoes squeaking slightly on the freshly painted surface. "Hello?" I called out again. "Is anyone there?" The footsteps had stopped. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the distant hum of the ship's engines. I did a slow turn, scanning the deck. Nothing seemed out of place. No signs that anyone had been here. I was about to turn back to radio in that it had been a false alarm when I saw it. A wet footprint, glistening in the moonlight, just one. In the middle of the deck, as if someone had stepped out of thin air, taken a single step, and then vanished again. I approached it cautiously, my heart racing. It was definitely a footprint. I could make out the treads of a shoe, but there was something off about it. It seemed too big, somehow distorted, and the liquid, it wasn't water. It was too dark, too thick. As I knelt down to get a closer look, I heard it again. Footsteps, but this time they were behind me. I spun around, my hand flying to my taser. There was no one there, but the footsteps continued, getting closer. Thump, thump, thump. I backed away, my eyes darting around wildly. "This isn't funny," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Whoever you are, show yourself now." The footsteps stopped, right in front of me. I could feel something, a presence. The air seemed to grow colder, and I could see my breath misting in front of me. That's when I smelled it. Salt. Rot. The unmistakable stench of the sea, but wrong somehow. Like something that had been under the waves for far too long. I turned to run, but my feet wouldn't move. It was like they were glued to the deck. I looked down and saw, to my horror, that I was standing in a puddle of that same dark liquid. It was creeping up my shoes, my ankles, holding me in place. The moment I saw the first passenger collapse, skin mottled and breath ragged, I knew we were in trouble. But it wasn't until the captain sealed us off from the rest of the world that I realized we had become a floating tomb, sailing into the unknown with death as our only destination. My name is Dr. Elena Reeves, and I thought I'd seen it all in my years as a cruise ship physician. Seasickness, sunburns, the occasional broken bone from an overzealous limbo attempt. These were the typical ailments I treated. But nothing in my medical training could have prepared me for the horror that unfolded aboard the SS Elysium. It was supposed to be a routine Caribbean cruise, 7 days of sun, sand, and relaxation. The Elysium was one of the newer ships in the fleet, a floating city with every amenity you could imagine. We set sail from Miami with 3,000 passengers and 1,200 crew members, all looking forward to a week in paradise. The first 3 days were perfect. Calm seas, clear skies, and not a care in the world. I remember standing on the deck that third evening, watching the sunset and thinking how lucky I was to have this job. If only I'd known it would be the last peaceful moment I'd have for a long, long time. It started with Mr. Daniels in cabin 4056. He came to the medical bay complaining of a fever and body aches. I diagnosed him with a mild flu and sent him back to his cabin to rest. By morning, he was dead. I've lost patients before, but never like this. Mr. Daniels' body was covered in angry red pustules, his eyes milky white, mouth frozen in a silent scream. It was like nothing I'd ever seen. Before I could even begin to process what had happened, more passengers started flooding in with similar symptoms. Fever, aches, then those horrifying pustules. Within hours, the medical bay was overwhelmed. I called an emergency meeting with the captain and senior staff. "We need to turn back," I told them, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to stay calm. "Whatever this is, it's spreading fast. We need to get these people to a hospital." Captain Hargrove, a man I'd always respected for his level-headedness, looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before: fear. "We can't," he said quietly. "I've just received orders from the mainland. We're to remain at sea until further notice. No ports will accept us. We're on our own." The gravity of the situation hit me like a physical blow. We were a plague ship, cast out to sea to protect the rest of the world. But what about us? What about the thousands of souls aboard who were now trapped with a deadly unknown disease? Over the next few days, the Elysium descended into chaos. More and more passengers fell ill. Those who were still healthy barricaded themselves in their cabins, terrified of catching the disease. The crew did their best to maintain order, but I could see the fear in their eyes. They knew, as I did, that it was only a matter of time before the illness claimed them too. I worked around the clock, trying desperately to understand what we were dealing with. The symptoms didn't match any known disease. It was like the virus was rewriting the human body from the inside out, turning our own cells against us. On the 5th day, when nearly half the ship had fallen ill, I made a breakthrough, or at least I thought I had. I'd been studying blood samples from the infected, and I noticed something strange. The virus seemed to be most active in areas of the blood with high iron content. On a hunch, I started treating patients with iron chelation therapy, medication that removes excess iron from the body. For a few hours, it seemed to work. Patients' fevers broke, the pustules began to recede. I allowed myself to hope for the first time since this nightmare began that we might have a chance. But then, everything went horribly wrong. The patients who had seemed to be improving suddenly took a turn for the worse. The pustules burst, releasing not blood or pus, but a black tar-like substance that moved of its own accord. I watched in horror as the substance crawled across the floor, seeking out new hosts. We lost a third of our remaining healthy population that night. As I sat in my office, head in my hands, trying to comprehend the horror of what I'd just witnessed, there was a knock at my door. It was Sarah, one of the ship's entertainers. She'd been helping out in the medical bay, showing a remarkable calm in the face of the chaos. "Dr. Reeves," she said softly, there's something you need to see." She led me up to the top deck. As we stepped outside, I gasped. The sky, which had been clear blue for days, was now an angry red. And on the horizon, where there should have been nothing but open ocean, I saw it. A mass of twisted metal and rotting wood stretching as far as the eye could see. Ships, hundreds of them. Ancient galleons, modern freighters, and everything in between. All of them looked wrong somehow, their structures warped and unnatural. "What is this?" I whispered, unable to believe my eyes. Sarah's voice was barely audible over the suddenly howling wind. I think we've sailed into something we weren't meant to find." As if in response to her words, a terrible screech filled the air. From the massive ships, dark shapes took flight. They looked like birds from a distance, but as they got closer, I realized with mounting horror that they were no birds I'd ever seen. Their bodies were emaciated, skin stretched tight over bone. Where there should have been feathers, they had what looked like strips of decaying flesh, and their eyes glowed with the same sickly light I'd seen in the pustules of our infected passengers. "Get below deck," I shouted, grabbing Sarah's arm and pulling her towards the stairs. "We need to warn everyone." But it was too late. The creatures descended on the ship in a nightmarish swarm. I could hear screams from all over the Elysium as passengers and crew alike fell victim to these monstrosities. We made it to the bridge where Captain Hargrove was desperately trying to steer us away from the Ghost Fleet. But it was like the ship had a mind of its own, drawn inexorably towards the horror on the horizon. "What's happening?" I demanded, my medical training warring with the sheer impossibility of what I was seeing. The captain turned to me, his face ashen. "I think I know what this is," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "My grandfather used to tell stories. Legends of a place where sick ships go to die. A plague port hidden from the world where all the diseases mankind has ever known fester and grow." I shook my head, unwilling to accept what he was saying. "That's impossible, it's just a story." But even as I said it, I knew it was true. Somehow our outbreak had drawn us here, to this nightmarish place where the laws of nature no longer applied. A violent shudder ran through the ship. Through the windows I could see we had entered the fleet proper. Ghostly figures moved on the decks of the surrounding ships, their bodies twisted and malformed. "We need to abandon ship," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. How many of us were even left to save? But the captain shook his head. "There's nowhere to go," he said, gesturing to the hellscape around us. "We're already dead. We just don't know it yet." As if to punctuate his words, the bridge door burst open. In stumbled Mr. Daniels, or what was left of him. His body was barely recognizable, more of that black tar than human flesh, and behind him a horde of similarly transformed passengers and crew. Sarah screamed. The captain reached for the ship's wheel as if he could still steer us to safety. And me? I stood there, my mind unable to process the horror before me. In that moment, as the tide of infected washed over us, I had a sudden, terrible understanding. This wasn't just a disease, it was evolution, brutal and uncaring. And we, the passengers and crew of the SS Elysium, were its latest experiment. The last thing I remember is the feeling of that black tar engulfing me, seeping into my pores, becoming one with my flesh. And as my consciousness faded, I had one final terrifying thought. This is how the world ends. Not with a bang, but with the silent spread of an infection we were never meant to understand. They say that to sail is to tempt fate, but none of us could have imagined the fate that awaited us on the SS Elysium. We set out for a week in paradise and found ourselves in an eternity of hell. And somewhere out there in the vast expanse of the ocean, our ship still sails. A warning and a beacon drawing other unsuspecting vessels into the embrace of the plague port. So if you're ever on a cruise and you see a fleet of ghostly ships on the horizon, turn back. For your own sake, turn back. Because once you enter the domain of the plague port, there's no return, only transformation, and the birth of horrors beyond human comprehension. The low, steady thrum of the engines had always been a comfort to me, until that night, until I heard the scream that shouldn't have been possible. I've worked on cruise ships for 15 years, 11 of those as chief engineer. I thought I'd seen it all, storms that threatened to tear the ship apart, equipment failures that could have spelled disaster if not for quick thinking and quicker hands. But nothing in my years at sea could have prepared me for what happened on the Oceanic Dream. It was our third night out from Miami, en route to the Caribbean. A routine voyage, or so I thought. I was doing my final rounds before turning in for the night, making sure everything in the engine room was running smoothly. The massive space hummed with the familiar symphony of machinery, the deep rumble of the engines, the hiss of steam, the whir of countless moving parts working in perfect harmony. I nodded to Johnson, one of the night shift engineers, as I made my way through the labyrinth of pipes and equipment. He gave me a tired smile in return. "All quiet tonight, Chief," he said, his voice barely audible over the background noise. I was about to respond when it happened. A scream cut through the air, high-pitched and terrified. It wasn't the mechanical shriek of metal on metal or the whistle of escaping steam. This was human, and it was coming from somewhere deep in the bowels of the engine room. Johnson's eyes went wide. "What the hell was that?" I held up a hand, signaling for silence. We both knew it shouldn't have been possible. Apart from the two of us, the engine room was empty. And the scream had come from an area where no one should have been able to access, let alone get trapped. "Stay here," I ordered, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm going to check it out." Johnson looked like he wanted to argue, but he nodded. I grabbed a flashlight from a nearby toolbox and set off in the direction of the scream. The further I ventured into the depths of the engine room, the more oppressive the heat became. Sweat beaded on my forehead and trickled down my back. The rhythmic thudding of the engines seemed to grow louder, matching the pounding of my heart. I swept my flashlight beam across the maze of pipes and machinery, half expecting, half hoping to find some rational explanation. A crew member who had gotten lost or trapped somehow. But deep down I knew that was impossible. This area was off limits to anyone but the most senior engineers, and for good reason. One wrong move down here could be fatal. The scream came again, closer this time. It set my teeth on edge and sent a chill down my spine despite the stifling heat. I spun around, trying to pinpoint the source. It seemed to be coming from behind a massive boiler. "Hello?" I called out, my voice swallowed by the cacophony of machinery. "Is someone there? Do you need help?" No response, just the endless drone of the engines. I inched forward, my flashlight beam dancing across the metal surfaces. As I rounded the corner of the boiler, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A figure stood with its back to me, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall and thin, almost impossibly so, and it was flickering, like an image on an old television with bad reception. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. The figure started to turn, moving in a way that was just wrong. Too fluid, too fast. Suddenly the lights in the engine room flickered. Just for a second, but long enough for me to lose sight of the figure. When they stabilized, it was gone. My heart was racing so fast I thought it might burst out of my chest. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a pipe in my haste to get away. "Chief? Chief, are you all right?" Johnson's voice snapped me back to reality. I realized I'd made my way back to the main part of the engine room without even being aware of it. I'm fine, I managed to say, though I was anything but. Did you hear it again, the scream? Johnson looked at me strangely. Scream? Chief, there hasn't been any scream. You've only been gone for a minute or two. I stared at him, uncomprehending. That couldn't be right. I'd been gone for at least 15 minutes, maybe more. But you heard it before, right, when I left? Now Johnson looked really concerned. Chief, I don't know what you're talking about. You said you were going to do one last check and then you just zoned out for a bit. Are you feeling okay? I opened my mouth to argue, to insist that what I'd seen and heard was real. But looking at Johnson's worried face, I thought better of it. Yeah, I'm fine, I lied. Just tired, I guess. Think I'll turn in for the night. Johnson nodded, still looking uncertain. All right, Chief. Get some rest. I made my way out of the engine room on shaky legs, my mind reeling. Had I imagined it all? Some kind of waking nightmare brought on by exhaustion and the constant noise of the engines? But I could still hear that scream echoing in my head, still see that impossibly tall, flickering figure. It had felt too real to be a hallucination. I barely slept that night, tossing and turning in my bunk. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure turning towards me. When I did manage to drift off, my dreams were filled with screams and shadows. The next day passed in a blur. I went through my duties on autopilot, unable to shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. I found myself jumping at every unexpected noise, flinching at shadows in the corners of my vision. As night fell, I knew I had to go back, had to prove to myself that it had all been in my head. I waited until the night shift had settled in, then made my way down to the engine room. Johnson looked surprised to see me. Forget something, Chief. I shook my head. Just want to do one last check, I said, echoing my words from the night before. Won't be long. This time, as I made my way deeper into the engine room, I felt like I was being watched. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and every instinct screamed at me to turn back. But I pressed on. I rounded the corner of the boiler, half expecting to see the figure standing there. Nothing, just pipes and shadows. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. See? I muttered to myself. Nothing here. You're losing it, old man. That's when I felt it. A cold touch on the back of my neck like icy fingers. I spun around, my heart in my throat. The figure was there, inches from my face. In the harsh glare of my flashlight, I could see it clearly for the first time. It wasn't human, it might have been once, but now. Its skin was gray and mottled, hanging loosely on a skeletal frame. Empty eye sockets stared at me, and its mouth. God, its mouth was open in a silent scream. I stumbled backward, a scream of my own building in my throat. The figure reached for me with long, bony fingers. And then the world went sideways. I felt myself falling, heard the clang of metal as I hit something hard. Pain exploded in my head and darkness swallowed me. I woke up in the ship's infirmary, my head throbbing. Johnson was there, looking worried. "Thank God you're awake, Chief," he said. "You gave us quite a scare." I tried to sit up, but the room spun. "What happened?" "Found you unconscious in the engine room," Johnson explained. "Looks like you slipped and hit your head on a pipe. You've been out for a few hours." I closed my eyes, trying to make sense of it all. Did you see anything when you found me?" Johnson frowned. "Like what?" I hesitated. How could I explain what I'd seen without sounding completely insane? "Never mind," I said finally. "Must have been a dream." But I knew it wasn't. As I lay there, I could still feel those cold fingers on my neck. Still see those empty eye sockets staring into mine. The doctor kept me in the infirmary for the rest of the voyage, diagnosis, concussion. But I knew the real reason I couldn't go back to the engine room. Knew that something was down there, waiting. I left the ship as soon as we docked, handed in my resignation the same day. They probably think I had some kind of breakdown, maybe I did. But I know what I saw, what I felt, and I know that I'll never set foot on another ship again. Because sometimes the ghosts we carry with us are all too real, and sometimes they're waiting for us in the places we least expect. Every night I still hear that scream, still see that figure turning towards me. And I wonder, what would have happened if I'd stayed in that engine room just a moment longer? Some questions I've learned are better left unanswered. The first thing they teach you about working on a cruise ship is that there's a logical explanation for everything. The creaks, the groans, the mysterious bumps in the night. It's all just the ship settling, they said. I believed that. Right up until the moment I heard the screams. My name's Alex, and I've been working as a steward on the Paradise Dream for the past 3 years. It's a massive vessel, capable of carrying over 5,000 passengers and 2,000 crew members. A floating city, really. And like any city, it has its share of secrets. It was our second night out from Miami, headed for the Bahamas. A routine trip we'd made countless times before. I was working the night shift, restocking the minibars and the lower deck cabins. It was mind-numbing work, but I didn't mind. The quiet of the sleeping ship was peaceful, a stark contrast to the constant noise and activity of the day. I just finished with cabin 4156 when I heard it. A dull thud, followed by a scraping sound like something heavy being dragged across the floor. It came from somewhere below me, which was odd. We were on the lowest passenger deck. There shouldn't have been anything below us except the hull and cargo holds. I froze, my hand still on the doorknob. The sound came again, louder this time. Thud, scrape, thud, scrape. It had a rhythm to it, almost like footsteps, but that was impossible. No one should have been down there. "Hello?" I called out, feeling foolish even as I did so. "Is someone there?" The noises stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening. I should have left it alone, should have radioed security and let them deal with it. But curiosity got the better of me. I'd been on this ship for 3 years, and I prided myself on knowing every inch of it. Whatever was making that noise, I was determined to find out. I made my way to the nearest service elevator, my heart pounding in my chest. The rational part of my brain kept insisting it was nothing, probably just some machinery malfunctioning. But a deeper, more primal part of me knew better. There was something wrong about those sounds. Something unnatural. The elevator doors opened with a soft ding that seemed unnaturally loud in the quiet corridor. I stepped inside, my finger hovering over the button for the lowest deck. For a moment, I hesitated. There was still time to turn back, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. I took a deep breath and pressed the button. The descent felt like it took forever. With each floor we passed, the knot in my stomach grew tighter. By the time the doors opened again, I was half convinced I was going to step out into some kind of nightmare. Instead, I found myself in a dimly lit corridor. Emergency lights cast a sickly green glow over everything, barely penetrating the shadows that clung to the corners. The air was thick and humid, with an underlying smell of rust and salt water. I stepped out of the elevator, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. "Hello?" I called out again, my voice sounding small and frightened. "Maintenance? Is anyone down here?" No response. Just the ever-present hum of the ship's engines and the faint creaking of metal. I started walking, not sure where I was going, but unable to turn back. The corridor seemed to stretch on forever, branching off into smaller passageways and storage areas. I peered into each one as I passed, half expecting to see some monstrous shape lurking in the shadows. That's when I heard it again. Thud, scrape, thud, scrape. It was coming from somewhere up ahead, around a corner. I quickened my pace, my curiosity overriding my fear. As I rounded the corner, I saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. A trail of water led down the corridor as if something wet had been dragged along the floor. In the sickly green light, it looked almost black. I followed the trail with my eyes, my breath catching in my throat as I saw where it led. At the end of the corridor was a door I'd never seen before. It was made of heavy metal, crusted with rust and barnacles as if it had been underwater for years. That was impossible. We were inside the ship, for God's sake. The noises were definitely coming from behind that door now. Thud, scrape, along with something else. A low gurgling sound, like water draining from a sink, or like someone drowning. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, to get as far away from that door as possible. But I couldn't move. I was transfixed, watching as the door began to shake in its frame. Thud, scrape, thud, scrape. Whatever was on the other side was getting stronger, more insistent. I could see the metal beginning to buckle. That's when I heard the scream. It wasn't human, it couldn't have been. It was a sound of pure anguish and fury, like 1,000 souls crying out in torment. It reverberated through the corridor, through my very bones, drowning out even the sound of my own terrified heartbeat. I ran. I don't remember much of the journey back to the elevator, just a blur of green-lit corridors and the sound of my own panicked breathing. I jabbed at the elevator button repeatedly, praying for it to arrive before whatever was behind that door broke free. As the doors finally slid open, I heard an almighty crash from down the corridor. The screaming grew louder, accompanied now by the sound of rushing water. I threw myself into the elevator, hammering the button for the main deck. As the doors closed, I caught a glimpse of something moving at the end of the corridor. Something huge and dark, glistening wetly in the emergency lights. The doors shut and the elevator began to rise. I slumped against the wall, my legs shaking so badly I could barely stand. What the hell had I just seen? The rest of the night passed in a blur. I reported to security, babbling about noises and flooded corridors and impossible doors. They searched the lower decks but found nothing out of the ordinary. No mysterious doors, no signs of flooding. They put it down to stress and lack of sleep, suggested I take a few days off, but I know what I saw, what I heard. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself it had all been a hallucination, a waking nightmare brought on by too many late nights and too much ship's coffee. But then the reports started coming in. Passengers complaining of strange noises in their cabins, wet footprints appearing in corridors only to vanish moments later, and always the sound of screaming coming from somewhere deep within the ship. The crew tried to keep it quiet, but word spreads fast on a ship. Rumors began to circulate. Old sea legends of ghost ships and cursed voyages, tales of entire crews disappearing without a trace. I've started to notice things too. The way the ship sometimes shudders for no reason, as if something massive is moving in its depths. The strange oily sheen on the water in our wake. And sometimes, late at night when I'm alone in my cabin, I swear I can hear that scraping sound again. Thud, scrape, thud, scrape. We're 3 days out from Miami now, in the middle of the Atlantic. The captains announced we're turning back due to a mechanical issue, but I know the truth. Something's wrong with this ship. Something's woken up down there in the dark, and it's angry. I don't know if we'll make it back to port. I don't know if I'll ever set foot on dry land again. But I do know one thing. Whatever's down there, whatever I saw that night, it's not going to stay hidden much longer. And when it finally breaks free, God help us all. As I write this, huddled in my cabin with the lights on full blast, I can hear it again. That scraping sound. It's getting closer, and this time, I don't think a locked door is going to stop it. If anyone finds this, if our ship is discovered drifting and empty like so many others in these waters, remember this. There are things in the deep that should never be disturbed, and sometimes they find their way onto our ships, into our world. The scraping stopped now, but there's a new sound. Water, lots of it, and it's coming from inside the walls. I think it's found me. I think it's found us all. God help me, I can hear it breathing outside my door.